presentation. And I would like to introduce Daniel Aletaha from the Vienna University, Austria. And he will present the principles and methods of deriving Eular recommendations. Please, Daniel.
Thank you, Maurizio. Thank you for having me here. I will talk about how we develop recommendations and criteria in Eular, and I think all of us had at some point in time one of these documents in their hands that says recommendations on something or criteria for something. And what we mostly don't do is question how these were developed. We go to table 1 that summarizes the recommendations, and we actually enjoy reading them. But, and I do it myself when I'm not involved in recommendations. I usually do it the same way. So the purpose of my presentation is to give you an idea of the principal methods of how these recommendations are developed. And I think I'm here also because I used to be the chairman of the clinical committee of Eular, which was handling all the projects that dealt with criteria or recommendations for rheumatic diseases. This committee was there more than 20 years and has a long history of very successful projects, and I will go into these today as well. So what I would like to do is in the beginning to start with telling you what Eular's vision and objectives are, because they're essential for us within Eular to plan which projects have a priority and make decisions on that. I will go into the methods of typical projects. I will discuss a little bit the terminology of the projects. You know, there's points to consider, recommendations, guidelines, criteria, and it's often very confusing to understand it. The standard procedure for projects, and give you at the end some overview of past projects. But let me begin with the Eular vision. I think it's something that is important for people outside of Eular to know what Eular stands for. And we have recently revised or updated these objectives that were going until 2012 from 2007. And now they've been there's another 5-year scope for them. And you can see objective 1 is related to research. I won't read them to you. I just want to give you the topics that we're actually are very ambitious about. So research is obviously central for Eular, being a central platform for innovative basic and clinical research. Education, and I think Hans, when I listened to you, I was impressed. Although I've been within this Eular now for a couple of years, when you summarized it, it seemed, and that's, I mean that in a positive way, it seemed it never ended, because there were so many different things. And I truly hope that the Eular website covers all of this very effectively, because it's hard to keep the overlook of all the educational projects that Eular offers, and I'm very impressed myself. So I don't think it will be hard to meet that objective, actually. The Eular Congress, you've seen the data on the Eular Congress and how it developed over the last years. Obviously, that's also an ambitious goal to keep it going and keep it in where it is. Eular is also dedicated to increase the visibility of rheumatic diseases on the political landscape, and that there have been great successes in the past to make rheumatic diseases, to put them on, at least on the European level, somewhere on the same level where cardiovascular diseases, where malignancies are. And I think that's very important, because our presentation, standards of care, relate to all these issues about defining criteria and developing recommendations, and I will go into this. Visibility for patients and healthcare providers, national relations. As you may know, Eular is an umbrella organization of different national organizations, so it needs to strongly interact with all the national societies, and they actually decide what happens in Eular in a democratic way. When it comes to EULAR funding for projects, there's essentially two objectives that are addressed by EULAR funds, and one traditionally, and one is the standards of care that I mentioned. These are the criteria and recommendation projects. These are usually low budget. It doesn't cost a lot to develop criteria. You need to establish a committee. I'll show you the process in detail. But my main point is developing recommendations is not very costly. It's more about the willingness of an organization to put its stamp on a product such as a criteria. Costly. It's more about the willingness of an organization to put its stamp on a product such as a criteria project or a recommendations project. And of course, there's original research, basic translational clinical research, and that carries, I mean, that in terms of cost is probably each project 10 times of what a standards of care project is, and therefore this has recently also been separated from EULAR with its own funds, and is not directly handled by EULAR anymore, but more by a foundation that takes care of this original research proposal. So within EULAR and within the clinical committee of EULAR, we're looking at standards of care projects and applications now, and there's been, now 10 years ago, the document published on how this needs to be done, the standard operating procedure for recommendation projects. I will just give you an overview here. It starts with a committee. You need a committee of experts, then you need a meeting of this committee. You need from somewhere you need some evidence. It's not sufficient to have a committee, you need to have the evidence at hand, and then with the evidence you go into the consensus phase. Evidence is very rarely in medicine, evidence is enough. If you just pull the evidence, you usually end up without any clear idea. You need a consensus process, and you need experts to value and integrate available evidence into recommendations, for example, and then you get the final product. Now, the committee is usually established by a convener that applies for a project like this to EULAR, and it needs to include a methodologist. That means someone who is experienced in doing obtaining the evidence. If evidence is obtained by literature search, the methodologist needs to be experienced in doing systematic literature searches. Also, the methodologist should be experienced in Delphi process and consensus methodology, because that's very important. If you don't have a clear idea of how to do that, you will, at the last stage, at the consensus phase, you will definitely get lost without a clear guidance and clear consensus process. And obviously there will be one fellow who will be the poor person doing all the true work, and then there is a group of experts, which is usually 10, 15 people, and from around Europe and also from outside Europe. Now, I was mentioning already a little bit, there is essentially, the evidence is the most important and critical part of recommendations. Without true evidence, there is, the value of recommendations is poor. Now, there's two essential methods that can obtain evidence, and that's analysis of original data. If you have the data and you can actually address questions that are relevant to develop recommendations, then you can do the data analysis during the project, so to say, do some way original research to provide the evidence. That rarely happens. Mostly what you do is literature search. And even if you do data analysis, you usually also do literature search first, but the literature search is becoming pretty standard in the ways, in terms of how it is done, and is a critical component of generating evidence. Now, I've mentioned the two different categories, and this is a terminology thing, but there's criteria projects and there's guidance documents. Guidance documents tell us or recommend us how to do something, while criteria documents give definitions. Now, within the guidance category, there's levels of strength, and Eular never published guidelines. From the terminology, its guidelines is very binding. What Eular published in the past were recommendations, and if recommendations is too strong, in relation to the available evidence, of course, then you would publish points to consider, which can still be guidance and still be helpful for the community. And for criteria documents, for example, that's classification and diagnostic criteria, but also outcomes criteria, right? Remission criteria and things like that. And for the guidance documents, it's management recommendations, and we have a lot of other recommendations. I will show you a list at the end. What I would like to do is give you just 2 quick examples of 2 projects where I was involved, where I can, so to say, also talk from as an involved person of how it worked with one project where there was mainly a literature search as a basis for generating the guidelines, and one project where there was an original data analysis. Let me give you the example of the RA management recommendations, and I will, you've seen the 2010 version in Professor Kutolo's presentation in the beginning, and 2013 there was an update, and I just want to give you an idea of how this worked. It's a recommendation project, and there were 3 systematic literature reviews, and these reviews informed the committee in the consensus process. Now, there was one search on, and it was easy in that case because you only needed to look at the literature between 2010 and 2013. So the workload was a little less than in the initial project where there were 5 literature searches. One was for the update on efficacy of synthetic DMARDs, and that included also glucocorticoids and also tofacitinib that was already approved in some of the countries. And one was on efficacy of biologic DMARDs, and one was looking at safety. And you can see, although it's never, and people also need to understand that doing a Eular project doesn't mean you get a publication in the Annals of Rheumatic Diseases. This is not at all the case, but since the topics are usually of very great interest to the community, they often do get accepted in the Annals of the Rheumatic Diseases, and these 3 literature searches, for example, are a great source of information on the last couple of years' development in the therapeutic area of rheumatoid arthritis. So they did not have major issues getting into the journal, whereas for other projects, you won't find the literature search in the Annals of the Rheumatic Diseases. Usually the literature search and the evidence phase is separated from the final product, from the statement on recommendations, because we have word limits and things like that. So I think I had 12 more minutes. Maybe I was talking too long on one slide. Let me just give you one example. So there's just one summary table of one of these papers that I showed you. So there was literature search, and this is the usual way to summarize evidence. And you can see this is about the risk of DAS28 remission for patients insufficiently responding to methotrexate. And in this particular table, there were 2 treatment strategies contrasted. One is biological monotherapy, and one is biological in combination therapy. Because there was the clinical question that was the basis for this in the initial meeting was, can we give biologics in monotherapy? Is there really use of combination therapy? So out of this question, the data were obtained and summarized, and what you can see here is the standard plot that gives you, either to the left favors monotherapy or favors combination therapy in terms of achieving a DAS28 remission. And you can see from the studies that actually looked at that comparison in that population, you can see the summary estimates are on the right-hand side, clearly favoring the combination, also for tocilizumab and golimumab in these 2 cases. So this particular analyses and results led to partly, but were the basis for one of the recommendations that said in patients insufficiently responding to methotrexate, biological DMARDs should be commenced with methotrexate. So the clear combination, and I think the with is also underlined in the presentation, in the publication. So it means if there is no good reason to do monotherapy, then you should commence a biologic always on top of methotrexate and not in monotherapy. Of course, there's 14 different recommendations, and you can imagine that this was a lot of work, but it pretty much went the same way that I showed you for one in an exemplary way. Now, I want to give you another project as an example, and that was the Eular ACR project, but it started originally as a Eular project, and this is why I put it here in the Eular session, because in the initial phase when it was started as a Eular project, that was when we did the data analysis. And I want to use this ACR Eular project as an example of how data analysis can actually help getting evidence as well. So this is a recommendation project. It's a criteria project, so now I confused myself. This is not a recommendation project, but a criteria project, and the literature review was the basis. Now, you can see that there's 9 different cohorts that were used for this purpose. That means 9 investigators provided us with their early arthritis patient-level data. We pooled them, and we had ended up with more than 3,000 patients to do data analysis here. And that was, I think, unique in history, that so many investigators, and each of these cohorts is a lot of work, and is years and years of work of establishing these cohorts and giving them for a project like this was, of course, helped us to actually addressing a lot of questions that were related to classification. We used this data to develop a first algorithm of identifying predictors of methotrexate treatment. That was the starting point, and that was a 3-step process then, by doing univariate, multivariate analysis, principal component analysis. And I just want to give you the summary slides to see how this great data set actually helped us developing the themes that you might now know from the ACR Eular 2010 classification criteria. You can see when we looked here, we found that several characteristics of patients in terms of predicting methotrexate start go together. You can see there's one factor that has a high load for rheumatoid factor and anti-CCP, so they cover the same theme. It's not very surprising to us. There's one covering CRP and ESR, so acute phase is one theme. So this principal component analysis was key to get all these predictors that we have into a sort of limited number, where you can say now we have 4, 5, 6 factors. We can say, we can even give them names. We can say that this one factor, ACPA and rheumatoid factor, you could call this theme serology, and you have to pick some relevant marker from it. So we said it's either or. You can say here you have one factor, wrist swelling, wrist tenderness, wrist symmetrical involvement. You call this factor wrist involvement, and you use wrist swelling as a surrogate to cover this area. So that helps you to getting down to a narrow number of relevant predictors that are useful in clinical practice. And then in a multivariate analysis, you put these factors that you extracted together, and you do you find the odds ratios for predicting methotrexate treatment, and you can see the odds ratios here, and they may already look familiar to you. This was the first step of getting the weights for the different components of the ACR Eular classification criteria. Now, I summarized in this slide here. And this is very difficult to advance. So how did the data analysis at that time inform the criteria? Well, it told us swelling of small joint regions has independent effect. So PIP has independent effect on top of MCP involvement, on top of wrist involvement. So if you have one involved, it doesn't mean the others are useless. So each of them is important. We found that tenderness, based on this analysis, is important on top of swelling. So this, and you may be aware that the new criteria now say, if you have this patient with one swollen joint and you do the joint exam, every tender joint counts as affected joint. And this is the basis for that recommendation. Symmetrical involvement, some people were wondering where did it go, and that actually fell out of the, in the multivariate analysis, fell out of the analysis. Acute phase response was newly introduced into the new criteria based on these results. And serology was not only expanded by ACPA, but also, as we've seen in the multivariate analysis, also introduced by dose-respondent manner, because the odds ratio for low-level rheumatoid factor or ACPA were 2, and the odds ratios for high-level were 4. So this is the basis for the final point system as well. Now, phase 1 was just phase 1, but this was the evidence, and phase 1 informed then the phase 2 that was conducted by the ACR mainly, so that the phase 1 was more the EULAR part and phase 2 was the ACR part. So this phase 2 was very important in generating also the clinician input. And in phase 3 they were integrated, and then the final product was created. But I want to show you, do you know this? Probably. I want to show you why evidence is often not, why consensus is often not enough. And I like this graph that came out of the classification criteria. And I actually thought about putting it on the wall because it looks very nice. It has, it's actually the result of a consensus process that we run under the group of experts. With 30 experts, and I can approve if you ask me about each of them was an expert. But when you gave them case profiles of patients that included the joint, the history, the symptoms, the CRP, and this is the patients that were presented, and they're ranked now by the average score across all 30 physicians. You can see that this is the rank of probability that a physician was able to give about the probability of being rheumatoid arthritis. So each physician was able to rank from 1 to 30. And you can see case 1 had almost all physicians were ranking this case between 1, 2, and 3 of highest priority for becoming a RA. And you can see here, the last case, you can see a somewhat greater spread over 6 or 7 ranks, being least probable of being RA. But you can also see that as soon as you move to the second most likely, you already spread over 10, and then everything here in the middle really is giving you the great heterogeneity of being a doctor, I would say, in a positive way, but also gives you an idea of how we disagree, how we as physicians value different things as important. So consensus is important. Consensus can give us answers about why physicians think this is high priority and this is low. And then we had them actually discuss with each other why one believes the same patient is high, and you can extract the important factors from the physician side, and then you put them together with the evidence factors that I showed you, and then you put them all on one scale and try to get the criteria. But one of each is rarely enough. So we need evidence and consensus, and sorry for being very long on this slide, but like I say, I mostly like the colors. So just a final thought, and you may realize I showed you the 7 objectives of EULAR, but mostly what EULAR cares about is actually improving patients, and all of these support in some way our patient's life. And we in EULAR a while ago decided that no EULAR project should run without patient involvement. And so they're involved in all phases of the projects, and this is criteria projects and classification projects, and patients are reviewing proposals, and we also have lay summaries for patients. Some of the patients may not understand our language, so at the end of the day, we wish to have 2 patients for each project. We summarized our recommendations about patient involvement in a document that you can read if you want, but the key point is no EULAR criteria project without patients. And now I just give you the overview of what we've done in the past, and you can see recommendations for management. There's a lot about different arthritis entities, ankylosing spondylitis, connective tissue disease, treatment-related aspects, systemic sclerosis, Behçet's, fibromyalgia, OA, crystal disease, recommendations about vaccination, and this is over-animated, but this is the recommendations for reporting and conducting research. Like I said before, I mentioned in the beginning, there's not only recommendations on management, but also for clinician researchers to how to do research in a specific field. And if you're working in one of these fields and planning a study, this is maybe a good source for you to get guidance on not to forget something. And there's classification projects, and you can see there's a lot of classification projects. You can see a lot of them are in collaboration with other societies, and many of them with the ACR. I think I've been part of the collaborations with the ACR now for a couple of years, and it's been going on for much longer than that, but I can say that these projects have increased in numbers because there was also an increase in trust and friendship across the Atlantic, and that's also, of course, an important basis for collaborations also for the future. And I think we will have great opportunities also to collaborate with other societies. We're not limited to ACR, but we have sort of already our standardized operating procedures in that form developed. But of course, I can imagine that EULAR would be interested in collaboration also with other societies as well. With this, I must show you my last slide, which is the challenges. And I say, whenever you have recommendations for management, you need to update them, and that's the greatest challenge. The more you produce, the more you need to update. We've just updated the EULAR management criteria for RA management. But you know, it's also, you open Pandora's box. Once you put it out, you need to update it, or it gets outdated. We have troubles still implementing criteria. We do not know how much they're absorbed by the community, how much they really change what they mean to change, and that is patient outcomes at the end of the day. Very difficult to assess, but great deficiencies on our side also to investigate this, and we've also been taking efforts to improve that. With this, I can only actually thank all EULAR officials and reviewers and patients that were involved in all the projects, and all the members of the task forces that have made these possible. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Daniel. A question, if there are questions from the auditorium. Let me see. I don't think so. So I thank all of you. I thank my co-chair and co-speakers, and I hope to see you soon again all together. Thank you very much.